It's a lot easier to say, hey, would you like to see a movie, than it is to say, hey, would you like to have a 2-hour conversation about circumcision with me? So part of my goal is to make that conversation easier. So hello, my name is Brendon Marotta. I'm the director of the film that you just saw.
Oh, I'm curious, who is new to this topic in this crowd? Okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
Am I introducing everyone, or do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Introduce yourselves and say whatever you like.
Okay, so I'm Ashely Trueman. I'm the
Director of Parents Education for a nonprofit called Local Ways. I, many years ago, developed a class curriculum for expectant parents on the topic of circumcision. I've taught it to over 300 couples. Okay. Taught it to over 300 couples now, with so far 100% intact rate. So working on getting that copyrighted and distributed. And I also help report doctors for forced retraction injury and report to the state licensing boards if they're not receptive to learning.
I think I'm going to double up my microphone here. My name is Brian. I'm the Associate Director of the Yale Hastings Program in Ethics and Health Policy. I work in a couple of different areas, but the main one academically I do is sort of male, female, and intersex genital cutting. And I'm trying to come up with an ethical framework that can comprehend all of these practices in terms of children's autonomy, rather than having a sort of sex or gender-based distinction or racialized distinction, as often happens as well. So that's why I'm here.
Hi, I'm Lauren Sardi. I am Associate Professor of Sociology at Quinnipiac. We are neighbors right up the street. I've spent the last 10 or so years doing research on the medicalization of circumcision and looking at sort of the parental decision-making processes that go on, and a lot of the institutionalized practices that continue to maintain this practice in the United States. So that's what I do now, and I will say that in all of my classes that you may take with me, we talk about this a lot because it permeates everything. So yeah, it's those kinds of classes, I guess.
Great, thank you. All right, so now we'll open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions for the panel.
Don't be shy.
I can give Brendon a chance to give more of an introduction too.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what you'd like me to say.
I actually, could you tell us who would your ideal targeted audience be for this film, when you originally were making it, or now that it's come to fruition, who would you like to see it?
I mean, the honest answer is everyone, but I feel like that's also the cop-out answer a little bit. I'd really like people who are potentially thinking about starting a family to see it, especially young people. I'd like people who want to know more about sexuality and understanding men and men's experiences to see it. And I think that people who have that intention to better understand others' experiences is something that crosses every demographic. So my hope is to just share the film with as many people as possible, and hopefully those who really want to see it and are open to it will find it.
Great, that can lead into my next question unless someone in the audience wants to jump in. Sorry,
Go,
yes, sir?
go ahead.
No.
First of all, I just like to thank you for what you've done here. And I don't quite know where to start in talking about this. I had a very severe personal injury experience with my infant circumcision, which I was a Coast Guard officer, I'm a Vietnam veteran. I left the Coast Guard because of my interest in in-depth psychology and experiential psychology and work that I began to do in that field, thinking I'd become a clinical psychologist and not really aware of all of my motivations in that. I thought I'd take a year off and go to massage therapy school as it was at a time when body work and psychotherapy were being integrated, and I thought, I do that as a sensual indulgence to get over my own hang-ups. The school was teaching the integration of body-mind, kind of stuff, mindfulness, exploration. And I had such experiences in that, of such a depth, and that I decided I would work toward a body-centered psychotherapy training and certification. And that's what I did in private practice for 25 years. Found it very satisfying and enjoyable. But one of the things that I won't get into any more specifics than that, but I worked with a lot of people with very early trauma and made discoveries in the process of my own training and experiences with ongoing supervision and training. And this is not something, as the body-centered psychotherapy is not something you learn from a book. You really have to learn it experientially. But the depth to which early injury, even in utero, when we come into this world, we have a plan for what we need, with expectations of when we're going to get it and who we're going to get it from. Knowledge about the world that comes from millions of years of evolution is in that blueprint, plan, and schedule that is part of that fertilized egg that we all come from. And when that's not there, it's like a binary circuit. When we come into this world expecting certain things, and they're not there, we wonder if we're on the right planet. How do we be safe here? How do we find our place in it? What does it take? And sometimes those early decisions, they go in one direction or another, and it's hard to get back there. If you've decided this is a threatening world, I can't trust, that underpins many decisions after that. And we all know the generalization of generally people who are hurt other people. We think we're going to make the world better if only we can control it. But as often happens, we don't end up making change. We end up recreating the situation that we were in and suffered from, but we become the causes of the suffering of others rather than changing the world, because we're on that edge of terror that is in our unconscious. So I'm really excited about the possibility of this beginning to deal with so much of the destructive behavior and trauma that is increasing, and as we're finding out through many sources, the heritability of trauma and the socio-cultural accumulation of heritable trauma. And we end up with people that are so desperately struggling alone and thinking that they have to control the world. Or, if you look at some people come into this world and the question is, am I on the right planet? And they're very bright, and it's when you come into the world with that kind of experience, it tends to lead one to get a great education and accomplish wonderful things. But it also leads people to think, well, I'll be safe if I can figure out a way to get to Mars and we can live in tunnels out there. But it doesn't give much hope for the future here on the Earth. And so I just want to, I'm inspired and enthused and hope to do something to assist in this process. I no longer, I've suffered from cancer from Agent Orange and have been very disabled and still deal with disabilities and ongoing problems with that. But it was such a shock going into the hospital and telling my clients who I'd been on very meaningful journeys with that I didn't know if I was going to come out and be sane again. But I'm ready to do something more. It's exciting and I'm shaking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I agree with you on a lot of that. One of the people who I interviewed who I wasn't able to find a place for in the film was David Chamberlain, who is or was the director of the Association of Pre- and Perinatal Psychology. And many of the people who appear in the film have had similar experiences to what you describe, of discovering that early life events had a very significant impact later on. And one of my hopes for the film is that not only does it provoke people to think about this issue, but it also makes them start questioning things about a lot of ancillary issues, about how we treat children early on and how we treat men and how we perceive masculinity and sexuality and a whole host of things. And I'll share that my own introduction to this subject matter came partially through some of the experiences you describe. It came during a period in my life where I was letting go of a lot of early childhood experiences that didn't serve me. But I'm glad you're here, because the healing that you describe, and it sounds like that you're working on, is something that men involved on this issue and this movement really need.
Sort of on that, I wanted to mention at the end you saw in memory of Jonathan Conte. He was an intactivist. I won't cry during this. I will. I'm going to cry, but I'm just going to talk through it. So he succumbed to suicide because of this issue, and the response that he got from his family, the dismissive, the mean-spirited response. And the intactivists who work on this cause, there's no joy in bringing the information to an individual who sets them off on that, oh my gosh, what was done to me, and now there's a grief and there's an anger. So there's no joy in bringing that information to anyone. So there is a burden that intactivists hold and a responsibility to those men that now have this information. And as it stands right now, there's really not an outlet or resource for those men to go to. So while on a personal level, there will never be another Jonathan Conte, there are already thousands of Jonathan Contes alive today, and as this message spreads, there's going to be millions of them. So we need to think of how are we going to handle those thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of men who are angry and feel betrayed and are grief-stricken with the medical and psychological and professional resources that don't understand. We need to be thinking about how we're going to handle that.
I have a couple of things to say. I never saw an intact penis until a friend was bathing her baby. I was married. And I said, oh, what's wrong with him? And she said, he hasn't been circumcised. Well, so that was the first sort of inkling that something different had happened. I mean, I knew that my husband was circumcised, my dad had been circumcised, my cousins, any man I'd ever seen naked had been circumcised. So we fast forward, David is in Vietnam, I'm pregnant with our first child, and I'm very actively seeking to have an awake and aware delivery and to be breastfeeding and so on. And I'm with the nurse who was giving the classes in childbirth. And she and I have gone up to the labor delivery floor of the local hospital, and we're having coffee. And there was some activity out in the hall. It was right across from the nursery. And she had talked about circumcision in the class, and she said, really, the babies don't feel anything. And there all of a sudden was this shriek. And I mean, I jumped up and started out in the hall to see if there was something to do. It was so alarming. And I said, what is that? And she said, a baby's being circumcised. And I said, you told us that didn't hurt. That's hurt. And she said, I lied. So that was the second information. Fortunately, the child who was born was a girl child. I had no idea how my husband would have felt about it, but I think I would not have allowed that to happen, having heard the sound of a baby, having that happen.
I started developing the circumcision curriculum. My office wall was shared with the circumcision room of a neighboring pediatric office. And the topic was already on my radar, but I was in the closet, and I say that's when the gloves came off.
Exactly.
And I said, there's childbirth education classes and cloth diapering classes and diaper boot camp classes, breastfeeding classes. Why the heck isn't there a class you have to take before you decide if you're going to cut part of your kid's penis off? And so that started it.
So we have 2 daughters, no decision necessary for us, but they had 2 boys each, and then finally a girl. And we were with our daughters when their babies were born. And we just begged, please don't do it now. Do not do this now. And one daughter was on the fence about it, actually had an appointment to go after the baby come home from the hospital, and she decided not to do it. Down the road, those boys, the younger one, I don't know exactly what had happened, but he was having irritation. He was about 7, and they decided that they would have the 7 and the 9-year-old circumcised at that point. And it was kind of funny because they were not very, they had never been very modest, and they would come to visit us and we would do a tick check. And they were sort of pleased with this new look. So they hadn't been emotionally damaged the way an infant is. And it's that infant thing that just tears me apart thinking about it. So, all right, I'm done. But
I wonder if I could say a couple of things in response to that, because it reminds me of a comment I made a few days ago at a similar event where I have a colleague of mine who's an anthropologist who studies rites of passage in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere where circumcision of men and women is done. And part of the point is that the pain has meaning, so you must not flinch because you're showing courage. And so you know it's about to happen, you know you're not supposed to show any response, you hold a switch above your head and you're not meant to react in any kind of way. And so this anthropologist colleague of mine talked to this man from Kenya who was explaining his experience, and he said, well, was it painful? And he says, yes, it was the most painful thing I've ever experienced. And then I bonded with my friends and I learned about my community and so on. And he said, what I don't understand about what you do in the United States is you do it to infants, where the pain has no meaning. All they have is this spreading, incomprehensible, right when they're coming into the world and beginning to engage in very important projects like learning how to breastfeed, learning how to form attachments, and so on. Some people say, well, it's better to do it in infancy because if you're an adult, you have to take some time off work or something like that. As though the infant's projects aren't even more important than the week of work you might miss. In fact, they're the fundamental projects by which you form your orientation toward others socially at a very critical developmental stage. And so to have introduced into that an inchoate, incomprehensible, excruciating experience that you can't even attribute meaning to, I think is very disturbing. The other thing that came out of your story for me is the sort of out of sight, out of mind aspect, which I think has 2 levels. The first is that circumcisions are done down the hallway. Typically you don't hear the screams. And so sometimes mothers will get the child back and notice that something's changed, that the psychology of the child is very different to what they had experienced in the early hours of his life. But there's also a sort of broader metaphorical implication of the out of sight, out of mind thing, which is that's just generally how this is done in the culture, is that nobody really wants to talk about genitals. And nobody wants to talk about suffering that has to do with sexual connotations and so forth. And so because it stays under the radar of consciousness, both in terms of what you're actually exposed to in a hospital setting, but also culturally, it's the sort of thing that persists precisely because people don't have to look at it. And if you look at it, you think, maybe this is something that ought not to be done.
well, that was one of the things that I wanted to question, and that was I have found ways with women who are pregnant or with men whose wives are expecting babies to say,
I hope you're not going to, or at least I hope you're thinking about not circumcising that baby. Think about what the experience is. And I could stand some help with that.
You can talk to me. Not now, because I could talk for hours on it. But a little bit on that. Whose responsibility is it to research and decide? I mean, we've already got whose right is it to decide ultimately, but in this culture, it is the parents at this point who say yes or no, and the doctors go ahead with it. There's a lot of
shifting the blame. When intactivists protest OBGYN conventions, the OBs say, don't talk to us, the pediatricians do it. At the pediatric conventions, they say, don't talk to us about the OBs do it. And then tends to be the OBs on the East Coast and the pediatricians on the West Coast, so they're both to blame depending on which coast you're on. But then they'll all say, well, I just do it because the parents asked for it. Now, if a healthy pregnant woman with a healthy pregnancy went to the OB and requested a C-section, as part of informed consent, it is the OB's duty to find out, why would you like this surgery? Does she have any misconceptions about vaginal birth? Does she have any misconceptions about C-sections? Is she aware of the surgical risks of C-sections? How about the recovery? What about the implications for future pregnancies? Is she aware of that? And because consent is a discussion, it's a conversation, it's not just a yes or no question. So an OB would have those kind of conversations if a woman was coming in and requesting a medically unnecessary perceived surgery with risks and potential long-term harm, even when it's about her own body. For some reason, when it comes to circumcision, it's, will you be circumcising? Yes, no, okay, whatever. You know? And that's not even a request for the woman's own body, it's on somebody else's body. So there's a hesitancy to question motivations. Why do they want this? Do they have misconceptions about the foreskin, about what the care is for it, about what the risks are, why it's done? That's what informed consent is, and if they're not having that, they're not getting it, and that's a big problem.
Hi. 35 years ago, I was teaching parents to massage their babies and training people to do that, and I had a booth at an expo, and I was taking a break, left a circumcision pamphlet, and that day changed my life. I saw the film last night, and I want to thank all of you for really bringing voice to this conversation to populations that might not otherwise do that. But tonight I'm having a very visceral reaction, which I'd like to vent here a little bit, and then I have a few other thoughts. But what I'm feeling now, and I did write an article counseling couples in disagreement about circumcision, a Jewish perspective. I have a 28-year-old intact son as a Jewish woman. My husband was very opposed to me, and what I carry is the burden you're talking about, how, you know, the bris that happened in my family, I wouldn't go. They said, you could be in another room. And the part, I think this film showed so much. I mean, we seeing Morris and showing it. But the one thing I feel, and I did want to write this, and I haven't yet, is empowering women to protect their sons. And the Jewish voice here, because the doctor who was talking about his tribe, I mean, Rabbi Kula said it very clearly that if you go to a bris or a circumcision, there's discomfort. People know. But what I want to talk about is the breaking of the maternal-infant bond. That trust, that protection of a child, you know, that doctor said, well, now he wants his mother. He's betrayed now. He wasn't protected. And the words that that doctor is using, I say that's what was done to him when he was circumcised. So he doesn't have that compassion for the baby he's looking at, because nobody had it for him. But there are many women, they are crying during their son's bris. When Ellie, his name, when he showed his film in New York City, there was a woman, a Jewish woman, her son had been cut 30 years ago. She did not want them to come to the house. She did not want it done. And she was crying 30 years later. She had never vented it out. And she left the religion. That was the end of my article. We are supposed to bring our families together with our religion, not create something that creates such discord between all. And to answer a little bit to your question, the woman is completely torn. It's a tug of war. Because when her husband is in denial and doesn't want to face it and doesn't want to oppose it, so she's torn between having this long-term relationship with him and wanting to protect her baby, and it's a tug of war, and some women can't reconcile that. If it weren't for Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, who I was lucky enough to meet, and he was an Orthodox pediatrician from University of Chicago who was willing as a Jewish doctor to separate the medical harm from the tribe part. He was not yet ready to let go of it for the religious reason. But through him, I learned about botches. And it was because of that that I was able to protect my son. I could not think in the future how I would ever answer his questions. So I had to fight through that. And I'm hoping what grows out of this film is an organization. I know that Norm, the restoration group, does that because as emotions come up, men are venting and they support each other through that. But not all men are going to want restoration, and as you were saying, it would be wonderful if we could have another organization, and it may be Rebecca Wald's dad, who has already done this type of work with men, to reach out to and see if we can get that to happen, just like we have doctors opposing circumcision and attorneys for the rights of the child. I'm trying to think about the question, I'm sorry.
Is this one? Okay.
I'm feeling very emotional right now.
I fully agree with you. Is this still working, or I should probably, I'll use both. I fully agree with you. We absolutely need more healing for men. And I really appreciate your perspective and willingness to speak on this issue and question it. At one point, I proposed an idea to some people of creating a site of some kind that connected therapists or healers who are interested in working on this issue with men who are interested in doing that work and healing. Because right now, a man will go to a therapist of some kind and say he has issues around this, and he doesn't know if that therapist is aware of this issue or not. So that therapist might say, well, what do you mean? It's normal, you know? Is there something wrong with you that you have issues about this? And now he's being gaslit by his own therapist. So there are a lot of therapists who are aware of this issue, and a lot of really good ones. And I'm aware of a few who don't talk about it publicly, and who, if you were a man trying to find someone to work with, you wouldn't necessarily know to go to them. And when I talked with another friend about this, he had a list of people who he knew of, and some of them were also not people who were not public on this issue. And so I would love to build a site or organization of some kind that therapists and healers who are interested in working on this issue could just add their name to. And I think it would be really beneficial for both sides, because there's a huge number of men who are interested in doing healing work around this, who don't necessarily know where to go. And if that was the site, those therapists would find a whole group of people who would want to be their client very easily through that. And I know, for example, that we mentioned that Jonathan Conte had ended his own life. When that happened, I got calls from several men in the movement who told me, I felt the same way at some point. And a majority of men I've talked to in the movement have expressed that privately in some way. So there's a huge need for it, and I would love to help connect the people who are interested in working on that. So if you are someone who's interested in working on that, or you know someone who is, please send them my way. I will start connecting them.
Hi, first off, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I agree with the overall theme of the movie that this is definitely a topic that deserves to be questioned and discussed. things that we take as convention should not remain convention. They should be discussed and considered because they may not always be correct. But I wanted to ask about consent, and I wanted to specifically talk about consent as a function of agency. And you talk about the fact that the children or the infants who are circumcised do not have the consent and therefore the agency to consent to these procedures. But at the same time, I see an inherent contradiction in saying that all adult males who are circumcised are inherently victims. That seems to take away their agency to decide whether they are victims in and of themselves. And so I was wondering if you could address that.
I've published a couple of papers on this issue of consent and the ethical issues surrounding it. So first of all, I want to say that it's up to each person to decide whether they consider themselves a victim. And one thing I find really troubling, one aspect of some dimensions of the anti-activist movement is this attempt for some men who themselves feel victimized or mutilated to require that all other men feel the same way. And I think that can't be very helpful. If somebody, all things considered, says, maybe I wish it hadn't been done, but I'm okay, well, good, let's keep it that way, as long as you don't carry on the practice. So I don't think requiring of others that they feel the way that you feel is a helpful approach at all. And I do think it is up to each person to decide whether they consider themselves a victim or not. With respect to the consent for infants issue, it's a very curious and difficult philosophical conversation to have, because infants can't, as it were, consent to anything that's done to them. They lack the capacity. So those who are in favor of genital kind of practices will often say, well, the child can't consent to anything, so it's up to me as the parent to decide what's in their best interest. But they forget that the mere lack of capacity to consent or to withhold consent doesn't therefore give parents a blank check to authorize whatever intervention into the child they want. So what you have to do is you have to triangulate between those cases where society has already drawn a limit, saying you can't cut off your kid's finger or something like that, and just apply that to the more contested or uncertain cases. So one example I've used in the past is that in most US jurisdictions you can't tattoo a child's body, certainly not an infant's body, until you're 18, and then it's a sort of autonomy-based argument that they ought to be able to decide about these long-term alterations to their own body. So if you were to have a tattoo on, for example, your son's foreskin, you'd be arrested. It would be a child abuse claim. But if you were to just cut off the foreskin altogether and then go tattoo it on the table over here, under current law, that's accepted. And so the main point that I raised about the consent issue is that clearly there are some things that's permissible to do to a child's body if you're in a caretaking relationship and you have the child's best interest at heart. But there are clearly also other things that it is not permissible to do to a child's body. And my view is that circumcision is the sort of thing that when compared to other cases that we already seem to agree as a society ought to be off limits, it seems to much more strongly fit together with those cases than with the sorts of things like, for example, ear piercing or vaccination, which are permissible interventions into the child's body because, for example, they don't remove erogenous tissue and so on and so forth. So I just want to say I essentially agree with both of your points, and I think that's an important distinction to draw.
Could I add something to that? I agree too. I think that how any person feels about circumcision, especially their circumcision, is up to them. I know that many in the movement, one of the reasons that there might be some people who would frame all men as victims is because very often the statement, well, I'm fine with it, or the people who say, well, that they personally don't feel that way, it's often an attempt to invalidate the feelings of men who do feel that way. So I think that a lot of that is a reaction essentially from men who do feel like they're victims wanting that acknowledged. Because anytime that you have a feeling that something was done to you that was wrong, there's a desire to have that acknowledged. I also, the majority of circumcised women feel the same way. They don't necessarily feel like they're victims. It's part of the reason I included a woman who has that perspective in the film. And whenever I talk about her perspective or share some of what she said, the thing that most people respond is, well, maybe she's fine with it, but women should have a choice. And it's like, okay, well, let's extend that logic. So I don't know that any person has to have any particular feelings about their own circumcision, and that's highly personal, and I would never expect anyone to, I would never tell anyone that they should feel a certain way about it. But I think that the people who do have a feeling of their own that they want validated and acknowledged by the wider world. And they feel like saying that everyone should have this feeling is a way to try to get that feeling validated.
Hi. I want to thank you for making the film. I listened yesterday live to the New York City question and answer only, and I was so happy that you had...
Shout out Robbie.
Yay, okay. Which I saw in the movie. I was like, oh, awesome. I was really happy that you had the screening, because I was going to head to New York City yesterday. I was going to head to Boston tomorrow. But this was great. I know this is probably not the audience you had there and will have tomorrow, but it's still super important to have it here. So thank you. Yesterday you talked about the tipping point, having that tipping point where most of society, or not most, but a good majority of the American people can say that this is ludicrous, like we all maybe here are saying, so that we can start taking a little bit more legal action or taking some other actions. I think one of the ways to do that, at least in my view, is, and maybe it's at a stall right now politically, but through immigration. And I have been able to convince a handful of American mothers to not circumcise their children. But I've had a really hard time in my own family. I'm firstborn American, and I've had a lot of older cousins who were born overseas who were intact when they came over, and then later were circumcised because of the misinformation of doctors here. They don't know what the heck they're doing. They don't know how to care for an intact penis. And it's sad when you walk in with an adult male who can make the decision for himself, but had an issue and walks in, and the doctor, before even saying hello, has said, "So we need a circumcision." And I remember jumping out of my seat at one time, thinking, no, that's not what we want. We want you to look at this and fix it. And it's not by surgery. But, it ended up being surgery for somebody, an adult, who didn't want it. So I'm concerned about the language barrier. I'm concerned about the population that's coming that has intact fathers and grandfathers. I have a 91-year-old grandfather who was intact. And I have an 11-year-old, so I was intact with no problems at all. But I'm concerned about the women who are signing off on things that they might not know that they're signing off on. And the adults that are getting circumcised, or even, teenagers or so.
This is a really tough case because the men who come from the generations who are the most highly circumcised, in the 60s, 70s, 80s or so, they're the men of childbearing age now. And they're choosing with their partners to cut their kids at the lowest rate that we've seen since it became a majority practice. But we have a medical system that doesn't show foreskins in most medical texts. We have medical texts that don't say anything about the foreskin other than flapper skin removed during circumcision. We have a whole slew of nurses and doctors and medical professionals who don't know anything about the foreskin other than how to take it off. They know the things that could go wrong with it, so they're looking for that. So the medical ignorance is a big problem. We have, in your whole baby, it's 2 years old, and we have a community group of over 20,000 members. And we've had to have a break off of the parents who are, or the women and couples who are expecting and how to educate them, and then the ones that have intact kids and how to manage their care, because nobody knows what to do with a normal penis. Forced retraction, Geishaker had said they get 100 cases a year. In our group, we're getting dozens a week that they're happening, and about a handful a year are so egregious, usually ER docs that are forcibly retracting for catheters, causing damage that...
And daycares as well.
At daycares, and even calling Child Protective Services on the parents because they haven't been forcibly retracting, or that they're refusing, they're not allowing the doctor to forcibly retract to do a catheter, when that's absolutely emphatically not what should be done. So in this culture, we have this, well, if you don't do it as when he's an infant, it will need to be done later. And everybody knows a brother's uncle's mailman's neighbor who had to have it done. But that's just not the case in countries that value the foreskin, where it's understood what's normal, how it develops, that separation can happen independently from retraction, and so that's a big problem, a big problem that we're working on. So.
I'll just mention one study to support that claim. So in Denmark, circumcision is basically done exclusively for religious reasons, and if it's necessary as a medical procedure. So those are the two cases where it's taken out. And so they have a very good health care system where there's careful tracking of basically every procedure that takes place in any hospital anywhere in Denmark. And so what they can do is do a very careful calculation of precisely how many boys before the age of 18 will actually require circumcision for medical reasons. And it's less than 1%, it's about half of 1% by the age of 18. So in a country where they would only perform it if it were a medical emergency, and otherwise, even if you have a foreskin problem, like say, you have a difficulty to retract when it should be retractable, they will apply a more conservative method. They'll apply a steroid cream or do a minor surgery or something like that. So the rate of actually medically necessary cases, when people say, oh, well, if there's going to be some problem that requires a circumcision later, it will happen in less than 1% of cases. And so it's only in a country where it's the go-to solution for a whole range of things that people think it's actually a common need later in life. It really isn't.
Hi, thanks so much. Excuse me. Thank you guys so much for coming out here tonight and showing this film. It's been really enlightening. I think it resonates with me personally for a variety of reasons, but I'm most particularly interested in just getting the word out to more people, because I kind of tend to think that most people would be easily swayed on this issue if they actually knew kind of what was behind it and the truth about it. The proportion of people who hold a very strong view in favor of this procedure probably are relatively small, so I really appreciate getting the chance to educate more people about it. I wanted to ask you guys about the timeline of going from non-circumcising to circumcising cultures to back down again to non-circumcising cultures, because the United States is not one of the only countries that has practiced this for medical reasons or for non-religious reasons throughout history. Canada in the past had relatively high rates, not as high as the US, Australia, some other Anglophone countries, but have all shown pretty dramatic drops in the rate of the procedure being carried out. So I'm curious about what you guys see are the best kind of points of leverage in policy and cultural shifts that could take place to follow a similar timeline to those countries, and also what we've observed there within the context of the United States.
If we look just in the United States, there's quite a drastic difference in circumcision rates based on states that cover it through Medicaid and don't. Of course, we don't have a great way to track what the true circumcision rate is, since we only can track based on hospital discharge, and if it's done by pediatricians, it's done outside of the hospital. So getting insurance companies to not cover it would, based on sort of the pattern we've already seen, likely have a larger impact in having fewer families choose it. Getting more insurance companies to not, or Medicaid to not cover it, also comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics saying, they have a line in their 2012 policy that's actually expired at this point that says the benefits don't outweigh the risks, but they justify financial reimbursement, whatever the wording is, financial reimbursement for those third-party reimbursement for those choosing it. So they say, oh, yeah, we should have insurance covering it. If we could get them to not have that anymore, a lot more insurance companies would drop it. So that's part of it. We're a for-profit healthcare system, which is different than some other countries. So money is going to play a larger role in our country than it would in others. It's going to have to be a bottom-up change. It's going to have to come from parents choosing not to cut their children, number one. Parents refusing to use providers who cut children. Parents refusing to go to facilities to have their babies who cut children. Refusing to pay into private health insurance plans that cover circumcision. So that's sort of the money side of things. It's going to be a long haul, but you chip it away that way.
Were you also asking about the history of how it became a large practice in America? Did I hear that question correctly?
Yeah, I know a little bit about it, but I'd love to hear more if you have insights on how it became medicalized from.
So a huge part of it was the rise of hospital birth. When births began happening in hospitals, there was actually essentially a smear campaign that was done on natural home births about how they were unsafe, about how they were dirty and lower class, and circumcision was one of the things that hospitals could charge for. So that became part of their standard procedure, if you will, because they were looking for interventions they could do in order to make money. And we had a deleted scene that was in an earlier version of the film talking about the rise of hospital birth and how that was sort of a contributing factor. And that also, hospital birth initially was it's not great now, but it was a lot more nightmarish then, because they would put the woman under full anesthesia, and often the effect of that wasn't necessarily that she was actually not feeling anything, but she just wouldn't remember anything. And when that was done, the child would come out under full anesthesia too. And so one of the things that Marilyn has said is that part of the reason that doctors may have thought that babies don't feel pain was because they would come out of the womb under full anesthesia that was given to the mother, which also isn't safe for the child. But again, this is, early 1920s hospital birth, and they were doing a lot of interventions that probably weren't safe. And part of the reason the rate has changed is because initially when it started, they wouldn't even ask for consent. It was just, this is what we do. Here's, the woman would go into the hospital, she would go under full anesthesia, she would wake up, and then the doctor would present her with her baby. And now, one of the reasons that changed was there was actually a Jewish couple who sued the hospital in the late 80s because the hospital had circumcised their child without asking them, and they wanted to perform a religious circumcision on the 8th day. And so, amazingly, one of the reasons that hospitals ask for consent now is because of a Jewish couple wanting to do a religious circumcision. That's actually one of the huge things that moved the movement forward. And it used to be that when you wanted to learn about this topic, the only source of information you had was your doctor. And so you'd ask him, maybe you had some peers, maybe if you were really resourceful, you'd go to the library and read some academic publications, and hopefully they had accurate information. Now, every parent who has a question about anything pulls out this and searches online for that question. And so what parents do now is, there's a consent form they have to sign, they have to make a decision, so they go, oh, I don't know anything about that, and they put circumcision in online, and the first websites that come up are websites of people who appear in my film. So that's actually been the largest change over time, has been the democratization of information, that we all have access to everything that's ever been published, all types of media, anything you'd ever want to learn about anything. And when it began, there was so little information about birth that even the woman giving birth might not remember giving birth. And now there's any kind of information you'd ever want to find. So I think that part of the reason that it grew was because there was a centralized monopoly with economic interests in doing circumcision that could charge for it. And part of the reason it's declining is that now people have greater choice and access to information.
It was covered in the movie, but I was aware of the many things that were sold by the medical world as to what circumcision would cure in terms of polio and a lot of bacterial caused diseases that they didn't know about the bacteria then. And this sense of cover-up or justifying things that may be advantageous to institutions or professions and the people within them and the status of those people within the profession is increasingly becoming a problem with people feeling betrayed by the institutions and professions that they're supposed to trust. And it's interesting to me. I've had arguments with at least, I think of a long one with one friend who's a psychiatrist, and he'd done a circumcision and felt like the baby didn't feel it. Wasn't much pain involved. And I'm frightened to think that some physicians don't know the difference between suffering and catatonia. Just when somebody's completely blocked feeling. But it's complex.
Are you going to have an intact version instead of an uncut version?
So I can answer part of that. We do have a ton of bonus features. I plan to release extended interviews of everyone you see in the film and a whole bunch of deleted scenes. And part of the deal I worked out with our distributor is that I get to sell those separately, so you'll be able to just find them all on our website when the film is out.
Well, I was just going to say to your point that my European colleagues say that the way that we address disease here is if you have some problem, we say what's the most conservative and effective way of addressing that problem, and we avoid surgery if at all possible. And so what you do in the US is you say, we have this surgery, are there any health benefits that follow from it? And then it's just completely back to front.
Two things. One, a response to you. I don't know in Canada, Australia, Great Britain, but one point I made last night that I didn't finish clarifying before is that the Jewish doctor, many Jewish doctors I meet here are not separating out the medical myths from the religious reasons to do it, and that's impacting the rest of the culture because they are on the task force for the AAP. And that's a real problem that I'm not quite sure how to deal with. And the other question I wanted to ask is about the industry. I remember I had a colleague say, but that's dirty and smelly and nasty, but as soon as they cut it off, then it's profitable, and the child and the parents don't make money on the derma patch and the creams. So I don't know if you have any current information on the industry of foreskins.
Just for people who are new to this, so the parents pay, or the insurance directly pays the doctor, the facility, to cut the foreskin off, and then there's a secondary market where the foreskins can be sold to biomedical labs for use in expensive face creams, anti-wrinkle creams. I know I'm getting the weird looks now. This is why you don't lead with this. Anti-aging creams, some burn treatments. So there's the profit on the front end of being paid to cut it off, and then also the reselling it to the biomedical labs on the tail end as well. So that's a double thing that she was referencing there. But I know I got question marks.
We covered the industry you're talking about in an earlier edit, and I made a choice to, in the film, focus only on things that were essential to the question, is circumcision something Americans should continue to do? So we had stuff on how treatments around HIV were changing, and stuff on different healing methods and ways that people emotionally process this. and things on the selling of foreskins. So they're sold to any place that needs tissue, essentially tissue banks. But although that's disconcerting and uncomfortable and something that presents an economic motive that certainly isn't clean, it's not essential to the question, is circumcision something Americans should continue to do? And so that was the choice I made for the film in terms of whether or not we talked about it. And also, was it something that we had an interesting interview subject or a really particular piece of information on? And I reached out to people from companies that use foreskins commercially, and they were not surprisingly wanting to avoid the camera.
I'm glad we brought up the economic impact of using like repurposed foreskins for medical purposes. And I'm wondering, back to the conversation around consent, if you think there's a legal leg to stand on about non-consensual use of body parts. I mean, I'm signed up as an organ donor, so if I die, people can harvest my organs. But if a kidney were harvested from a child, that would obviously not be consensual, even if their parents said that that was okay. But I'm just wondering if, like, where do you draw the line with somebody else getting utility out of a harvested body organ, and if that might actually be like a worthwhile legal fight rather than the bioethics of it?
Okay, I will address that. So normally speaking, when you sign an informed consent sheet, being an adult, actually part of the language says that whatever parts of your body that is removed, they get to keep. And it's pretty explicit, like this is no longer part of your body, and we own it, and there's actually a list of various things that can go on with it, sort of afterwards, and who can be in the room while you're under, and sometimes, there are going to be med students, and they're going to take pictures, and, don't worry, we're not going to put your identity in there. So there's actually a way that has been addressed pretty specifically in a lot of those informed consent documents that you sign that they don't really give you time to read thoroughly. However, that's not explicitly noted in any of the proxy consent forms that I have seen. I call them proxy consent forms for circumcision because the patient cannot actually give informed consent, and the parent actually also can't give informed consent either. So the best that we have is this like really messy proxy consent. And even then, proxy consent is only still able to be given in the case of medical necessity. And so it sort of then follows, or is sadly logical, that they're not going to have anything regarding body parts or anything like that, or who owns it or anything like that. Oftentimes it's just, sort of discarded as medical waste. I think that there has been a movement towards looking at boys who were born 1996 and later. There's been this push towards thinking about suing for protection under the Equal Protection Act in the Constitution, because if girls are legally protected against any form of genital cutting, then boys should also be protected from the same thing. So there is that sort of logic that's been raised. I don't know as though anyone has ever really followed through with that. I don't know if anyone has any additional information about any pending cases or anything like that.
Oh, there's a couple of cases. So right now, Iceland is considering banning circumcision based on two reasons. One being that all forms of non-therapeutic female genital cutting are already illegal in Iceland, and the sponsor of the bill said it seemed like there was some sort of discrepancy here. In response to that, people say, well, of course, but female circumcision is so much more harmful and it's very bad and so forth. The response to that is just that there's about 35 different forms of female genital cutting that play out in different groups. Some of them are less invasive than circumcision, involving, for example, pricking the clitoral hood. So this is what's now happening in Detroit in the United States. The first federal FGM case is being prosecuted, and it concerns a group called the Dawoodi Bohra, which is a small Muslim sect based originally in India, but with members around the world. And they perform circumcision of both their boys and their girls based on similar scriptural support in the Hadith, the sort of sayings of Muhammad, not the Quran, the main scriptural text. And the form of circumcision they do to their daughters is on any view far less invasive than what they do to their sons. But because only female genital cutting is a federal crime in the U.S., it triggered these criminal proceedings, and they face life in prison for performing a procedure on their daughters that is far less invasive than what they do to their sons. So this sort of legal asymmetry is certainly going to become apparent as this case plays out. And when that happens, it's very hard to know what to do to it. What defenders of ritual male circumcision have now been doing in the literature is saying, well, given that male circumcision is clearly okay, and given that there is obviously this double standard, we should allow for so-called minor forms of female genital cutting. And so they've been advocating what they call a ritual nick or a vulvar nick, and because they take male circumcision as the standard of harmlessness. And so they say, well, if there's a form of FGM that's less invasive than that, surely that's even more harmless. I think rather the way to proceed would be to move in the opposite direction, but this is now a debate that's going to have to be had.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to open it up for any final thoughts from the panelists before we go.
I'll say one thing. So one of my hopes for the film is that it makes this conversation a lot easier to have. Because if you have a friend who is having a kid, thank you. If you have a friend who's having a kid or is interested in learning about this subject or simply might stand to benefit from learning about it, it's a lot easier to say, hey, would you like to see a movie, than it is to say, hey, would you like to have a 2-hour conversation about circumcision with me? So part of my goal is to make that conversation easier, and I would love it if you were able to use this film when it's out as a tool for that. As there you go.
A couple quick tips when you're starting that conversation. Instead of asking, will you be circumcising your son? Will you be keeping him intact? A lot of people are not familiar enough with the term. They have a question mark. It's a lot easier for people to say yes to questions than it is to say no. Another thing, if somebody comes up and they say, yes, we're circumcising, so, oh, which method did you decide to use? They will, I have asked that to probably in the hundreds now. Nobody even knows that there's different tools that are used. They don't know. Some leave darker scars, some are quicker, some are, more common. So those are 2 little quick entry questions for you.
Thank you. I'll just add, I used to do a lot of baby fairs to educate parents, but I carry my 3x5 cards wherever I go, even if I'm blueberry picking, they're in my pocket somewhere. And if I see a pregnant woman, for me, I have to say something. And because I love people so much and I've done this for so long, somehow it works. I can't sleep at night if I know I didn't try, because usually what I'll say is, I know parents who will go to their graves, they say it's their worst nightmare, and I just want to make sure you have as much information. Somehow it works. And sometimes they get very irate at me, which I now realize will happen, and I say, oh, you have a pretty scarf, and have a good day. And I don't try to keep going anymore. I know in 5 seconds, but some people thank me so much. So wherever I'm going, my advocacy goes with me.
Great, thank you. If we could have a round of applause for the panelists. Excellent, and a huge thank you to Effie and Caroline in particular. And thank you all for coming out tonight. This was a great conversation, and I hope that you come away inspired, ready to talk about it more.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.